Cheers to you. So should I be allowed to take a sip of liquor while I'm teaching a course? Well, on one hand, I mean, it's my choice, right? My body, I get to choose what to put into it. I'm teaching the course, so it's like my course. And so why not? As long as I do a decent job, why shouldn't I be able to take a little sip? Now, on the other hand, one could argue that maybe sipping liquor during class isn't really respectful of my students, of the content I'm trying to cover. Maybe it's likely to make me less effective at doing my job. Maybe my university has a policy that says you can't drink liquor while you're teaching a course. I actually don't know if it does. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the faculty handbook or somewhere there's a rule saying that. So, I'm sipping LaCroix sparkling water, not liquor at the moment. But the point there is one that applies to a whole lot of things. So should I be able to do something that I want to do because I enjoy it? And how do I weigh that against the way it may affect other people? So we talked about that a little bit before, not directly, but when we talked about sexual behavior and prostitution. So now we're going to talk about illegal drugs. Well, actually, it doesn't have to be just illegal drugs. Like alcohol is a legal drug, right? So most people would say a drug is some substance that affects the way that you think and feel. So alcohol, nicotine, those would be legal drugs. Cocaine, heroin, those would be illegal drugs. Some drugs like marijuana might be legal in some places and illegal in other places. So the legality of it doesn't necessarily matter all that much. The moral issue is going to be pretty much the same, whether it's legal or illegal. It may change the moral calculus in different ways, depending on the legal status. But there's still this core issue of how much does my choice of what to do, doing what I want to do, how do I weigh that against the way that it will potentially affect other people? And rules that may have been made to govern behavior, to avoid negative consequences. Maybe I know that I could sip liquor and it wouldn't affect the way I lecture in a course. So there's a rule that the university has that says you can't do this, but I know that the reason they made that rule, that they're afraid that professors drinking would affect their ability to do their job, I know that the reason for the rule doesn't apply to me. So if the reason doesn't apply, then maybe the rule shouldn't apply, right? So those are these moral issues that come up with things like alcohol, with things like tobacco. And, I choose to light up a cigarette because it brings me a sense of satisfaction, it calms me down, it does whatever. But it may also affect people around me. There may be these externalities, secondhand smoke, but even beyond that, there may be externalities, my interactions with, say, the healthcare system may look different because of my smoking behavior. In fact, we see hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. die every year from smoking-related illnesses. That affects our healthcare system in a big way, some of which is internalized, some of which other people are kind of subsidizing. So there's an externality there too. So we get that with all sorts of issues with these both legal and illegal drugs. And we see a big debate going on in the U.S. right now about legalization, especially of marijuana, right? That's where we see a lot of states bringing ballot measures and other sort of proposals on whether to have cannabis be totally illegal, which is kind of the traditional legal status of it, or whether to allow medicinal use where it's been prescribed by a doctor, or whether to allow recreational use so it's fair game for anyone to use. Or probably not anyone. As far as I know, states have age limits, much like alcohol and tobacco. You say below a certain age, we don't want people imbibing this when they're young and developing, perhaps not as good at making decisions about risky products, but also still developing their brain in ways that may be affected by these different chemicals. That brings up a lot of these moral issues right there, right? How do we think about people making choices about what to do and how to balance that against kind of the societal needs, and even beyond the societal needs, just ways that other people are affected by this behavior. And so, I mean, tragically, with many people have talked about an opioid epidemic, right? And so there have been big lawsuits against Purdue for OxyContin. Purdue is a big pharmaceutical company, maker of OxyContin, an opioid that was widely prescribed starting in the 90s. And they really pushed it, Purdue Pharmacy did, and it became one of the most popular drugs in the US. It's still a very popular drug, and if not just OxyContin, a lot of other drugs that are very similar to it. And unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of people every year who are dying from opioid overdoses, right? So lots of people who are addicted, many of them have legal use of these opioids. They're prescribed by a doctor. Many people are also illegally using opioids. Many of them start with a legal prescription, get addicted, then switch to illegal street use. So it's a difficult situation. A lot of lives are being affected by this in big ways. I mean, people dying of overdoses. It's not just those people who are affected, it's their families, all the people who love them, who care for them, who work with them. There are big ripple effects that move out throughout society. And so, I mean, that's why this is a tricky issue when it comes to drug use, whether it's alcohol or heroin. We want people to be able to make choices about what they do. And so kind of the libertarian free market, the pure capitalism sort of approach to it is it leans toward letting people do what they want to do, what brings them joy. So let people drink if they want to drink. Let them smoke if they want to smoke. Don't regulate it too much. I think almost everyone in the U.S. would agree that there should be some age limits. We don't want 8-year-olds smoking cigarettes or drinking beers. But we could argue about what the appropriate age limits would be. We could also argue about things like labeling and public campaigns to provide information about tax levels. These are ongoing debates that are important about things like alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana and opioids. It's a tricky thing. So we've got a desire to let people make their own choices, and if you want to have a beer after work to unwind, I mean, we should let you. And if you don't want to, that's great too, right? On the other side, I mean, the whole idea behind the temperance movement, that was the 19th Amendment, saying that 18th Amendment, sorry, 18th Amendment, saying you can't drink alcohol. Alcohol is illegal. The idea was not that we shouldn't let people make their own choices. The idea was that these things are detrimental to society, and it's destroying families and livelihoods. And so that's a similar argument you see with the argument about legalization of marijuana, and is this kind of a gateway to other harder drugs? You see this in a debate about how widely opioids should be prescribed by doctors. You see countries like Portugal that have decriminalized almost all drugs and said, if people want to use drugs, they can make their own choices. Very many people who use a lot of these drugs end up getting addicted to them in one way or another. We should offer a lot of help to people who have a hard time stopping, who are engaging in troubling behaviors, who have this disease of addiction. We should try to help them with that, but we shouldn't try to help them by throwing the book at them with criminal sanctions, throwing them in prison, etc., which is kind of the U.S. approach to a lot of our drug policy, war on drugs, send a lot of people to prison, many of them nonviolent, and that has led to this huge incarcerated population in the U.S., and that is a huge tax burden for U.S. citizens. So it's a tricky issue because these things do rip apart families and communities and have huge negative externalities, at least potentially. But there are also things that a lot of people derive a lot of enjoyment from. So whether you're talking about tobacco or alcohol or heroin, all of these drugs involve this kind of trade-off between letting people make their own choices or doing things for kind of the greater good. And so you may be noticing there's kind of a theme coming up with this week 3 material. Whether you're talking about prostitution or drugs, we often see this trade-off. Many of the moral issues that come up when we're talking about some of these issues, how much do we let this kind of personal autonomy, people make their own choices, libertarian sort of idea drive what policies we have in our society? How much do we have policies that are based on the greater good, societal good? And so that's a recurring theme throughout the course, and especially this week. And it's definitely one that is part of a healthy debate we have about stuff like legalization of marijuana.